Hello class. In this video, we're going to be learning how to sequelize our database and how to use Sequelize to access our database. And it's not my fault that they called it Sequelize, guys. It's a verb. It should be either to sequelize or sequelizer. They should rename it. Anyway, so we're going to learn how to use Sequelize, and what Sequelize is basically is an ORM. What that is an object relational mapper, which essentially is just a library that lets us connect to our database and perform operations without having to write raw SQL queries. It abstracts away all of the raw SQL stuff and gives us some JavaScript functionality to work with, which is pretty cool. It makes it easier to interact with our database models, tables as objects instead of just having to map all of that ourselves. So like I said, Sequelize is SQL based, so it works with all the SQL based databases, and I'm going to be using Postgres, but feel free to use MySQL if you prefer, or anything else that's SQL based. So before we start, please do me a favor and hit the like button. I'm trying to grow the channel, and subscribe and hit the bell button if you haven't done that yet. So let's actually get to the code. Alright, so in the Sequelize.org website, let's go to v6 documentation, and here let's go to getting started, and here it tells us to install Sequelize and whatever database driver that we need. I'm using Postgres, so I'll need these two, so I'm just going to copy them. Let's head over to VS Code. I've already created a folder called Sequelize. I'm inside of it with VS Code. So here I'm going to create an entry file. I'll call this app.js. And here, let's install our dependencies. So I'll open the terminal again, and I'll say npm install Sequelize, and those two things, pg and pg-store. And there are a couple of things how to set up our connection. If you go back to the getting started guide, it can tell you how to create that instance yourself and do all of that. But we can also use something called the Sequelize CLI, which is pretty cool. I'll show you. So back in VS Code in our terminal, let's install this dependency, and let's install it globally because we're going to need it later. So let's say npm install -g sequelize -cli. Hit enter and let it install. And this is a nice tool that lets us do so many things with Sequelize. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say Sequelize init, which is going to initialize Sequelize in our project. So it's going to create a bunch of stuff. First thing, let's go top to bottom. We have config/config.json, which holds a couple of database connections. So there's the development one, the test one, and the production one. And of course we're in development, so let's populate this one. For me, the username is classed for my Postgres, and my password is root. Now fill them with what matches your credentials. And for the database, let's create a database and let's call it Sequelize_db. Be careful in SQL, dash doesn't work, so it has to be an underscore. And the host, that's fine. And the dialect, I'm going to change that to Postgres. Now, if you're using something other than that, you can look at these and use whatever that is relevant to you. So I'm going to save that. And let's go through the rest. We have a migrations folder, which we're going to cover later, so let's not worry about it now. And we have a models folder. And inside of there, we have this index.js. And what this does basically is it imports the configuration that we just looked at, and it uses the environment that we're using right now, which is development, gets the credentials, and then goes here and creates a Sequelize instance, which is kind of like a database connection instance that we'll use. And then what it does, it's going to loop through this directory and import any other file, which is a database model if it's inside this folder, and initialize it and add it to array, and then export that array alongside with the Sequelize instance, the connection. It actually also exports Sequelize with uppercase S, which is the library itself, but I'm never gonna import it from this, so I'm just gonna remove that second line. So let's save this. Now let's actually connect to our database. Or actually, let's create it first. It doesn't exist. So without actually going to PSQL and creating it, there's already a command that lets us do this from the Sequelize CLI. So if we type Sequelize, it's going to show us all the commands that we can use. And I'm interested in this db create. So let's say Sequelize db:create and hit enter. And now it's actually created that database. And to double check, I'm going to open a new terminal. I'm going to say PSQL, connect to my Postgres server, You can connect to yours. And here I'll say \c to connect to Sequelize, Sequelize _db and hit enter. And now I'm connected to that DB. So it was actually created. So that's cool. Let's start to create a table in our database. So let's say I wanted to create a users table, and the users, each user has a name, a role, and an email, for example. So for this, we need to create a database model. So if we go back to the other terminal, here we can use the Sequelize CLI to create a model. And by the way, you can always go back to the documentation and go here, model basics, and it's going to tell you a lot more about models and how you can create them. One thing you have to be careful with the Sequelize documentation is that they show you how to do the same thing multiple ways. For example, here they show you how to create the model using define, and they show you how to create it using ES6 classes, which is the preferred way. So I'll stick with the CLI because it kind of like maintains the same convention if you just use the CLI. So using the CLI, I'll say Sequelize model :generate, and here we'll need two flags. The first one is the name, so -- name, and this will be user with the uppercase U, and here the attributes, so -- attributes. So we have three attributes. So there's the name, and we do name : and after the colon we say the type, which is a string, and then comma to separate them. So I need also the email, which is a string as well, and also the role, which is a string as well, and hit enter. And by the way, you can always hit enter and add more attributes if you want later. You don't have to put them all here. So let's close this, and now we have this model inside of our models. And here it basically just imports the model from Sequelize, and then it exports this function that has this class user inside of it, and it also initializes the user as this function is executed. So if you go back to the index.js, you'll see that once it imports that model from that file, it straight away passes it these two things, the connection instance and also the data types from Sequelize, so that the model can use them to initialize itself. So let's actually go back to our app.js and let's import that Sequelize connection instance. So here let's say const and destructure Sequelize with lowercase s equals require from the same directory /models. And because it's index.js, we don't need to say /index.js, of course. So here let's create an async function main, and here we're gonna say await Sequelize.sync, which what it does is basically it looks at our models and it creates database tables in our database depending on what models we have. So here we have to call the main, of course. So do main and then save. And now let's go back to the terminal and let's say node app.js and hit enter. And now I actually created that table. You see it's logging the SQL queries to the console. So if we go back to pSQL and say \dt, we'll see that there is a users table. And if we say \d users, actually I just realized it named it uppercase users. I need to change that. So by the way, you need to wrap it with double quotations if there's an uppercase letter in there. I hit enter. We do indeed have that we have an ID and those three fields that we specified and some timestamps as well. So that's nice. That was easy. Two things I want to change is I want to change the table name to lowercase u here, users, because that's more of a SQL convention. And also I want to make the name, the email, and the role not nullable because right now they are nullable. So let's go back to our model. So user.js. And here we can, so as you see here, there's init. The first thing you pass it is the fields. And the second thing is options. And with the options, you can add another option called table name. Table name. And this, I'll give it the value of users with lowercase u. So let's save that. And also here for our fields, they're not going to be just simply a type. I'm going to cut that. I'm going to make this into an object. And here let's say type and pass that datatypes.string. And here we're going to use a variable called allowNull and set it to false. By default is true. So actually I'm just going to copy this and paste it 2 more times for the other 2 fields and save. And now let's go back to our app.js. And actually if we start our app.js, I don't think it's going to work, but I'm just going to double check again. Yeah, it didn't change anything like I thought. So here in sync, if you don't pass it anything, if the table exists, it doesn't change anything. So we need to actually pass it some options, and we need to pass it, actually it's either alter or force. So I'm going to try alter. I think this allows it to alter the table if it exists. So node app, and then we go back and we check in Sequelize. Let's check what tables. Oh, okay, so it created the new table and it left the old one. So one thing that we can do is we can use another option called force and set that to true and save. And now if we go back to the other terminal and do a node app, yeah, it actually drops all the tables that there are. Actually, not all the tables, sorry. It doesn't drop the users with uppercase U because we didn't use force earlier. So if we go back and we do \DT, yeah, we still have this uppercase users table. So we can actually manually delete it. So we'll say drop table uppercase U users, actually users, hit enter. Now it's actually dropped it. And now if we describe the users with lowercase u, we actually get that those fields do exist and they're not null. And of course, the table is called users with lowercase u. Let's start to use the Sequelize API to access our database and perform operations on that. To do that, I'm actually gonna go back to my other terminal. I'm gonna install Express so that it makes it easier to have multiple endpoints to test different things. So let's install, let's say npm install Express, and then minimize that. And here in our app.js, let's tab that down. And here, let's say const express equals require express. And let's create a new express app. So let's say const app equals express and call it as a function like that. And here I'm going to create the first route that will allow us to create a user in our database. So here I'll say app.post and then open that and do this will be to /users, and this will have an async handler. So async request response, and it's going to do something, do an arrow function. And here I'm actually going to take stuff from the request body. So I'll say destructure name, email, and role, and say equals request.body. Actually, I think we need to use the JSON parser so that we can parse the body if it's a JSON. So here, let's say app.use and say express.json as a function like this. So we need to use that JSON middleware. So here we're going to get the name, the email, the role from the body. And here, let's do a try catch block. So let's try. To create a new user, we're going to need to say await user. And actually, we need to import user from the models. So here we'll say user like that. Now we'll say await user dot create, and we'll pass it an object with all those keys. Now, of course, the values are the same as the name of the properties. So we can just say like this, name, comma, email, comma, role. Actually, I want to return this. So let's make it into a variable. So const user equals that. And let's return it. So let's return res.json, JSON user. Of course, we need to say catch here. And if there's an error, we're just going to console log the error. And we're just going to return res.status 500. I'm actually going to return the error as well, the JSON error. Let's scroll down. And here inside of our main, we need to actually start that app. Actually uses a callback. So we can actually get rid of this main, get rid of that, and say app.listen. Let's pass it an object with the port, and I'll give it the port 5000. This takes a callback, and I'm going to make it an async callback because we need to call the Sequelize in sync in there. And then I'm just going to move this line inside of there. I'm going to console log before that and say server up on http://local host 5000. And after that, we can console log and say database synced. Save that and go back to the terminal. And here, let's say node app and hit enter. There we go. We get, where is it? Server up on localhost 5000, and we get database synced. So if we open an HTTP client, so I'll open Insomnia. You can use Insomnia or Postman. They're both kind of the same. And here I'm gonna actually use the same request, and I'm gonna change this to localhost 5000 and change this into a post request. And in the body, I'm gonna select JSON. and I'm going to give it a JSON body with a name, and let's say this is John Doe, and an email. Let me actually make this bigger. Email, and this will be john@email.com. And we'll give it a role of, let's say John is an admin, so admin. Now let's run that. Okay, we get not found. Oh, because, okay, my bad. Actually, that was /users. So to /users, hit enter. There we go. We actually get the response with a ID and a created at and updated at, meaning that it actually was persisted in the database. And if we go and check in our database and we say select star from users, semicolon, hit enter, there we go. We indeed get John Doe in there, and it's persisted in our database. So creating is actually working. Now let's add another field to the user, because we don't want to use the regular natural number ID, because that's a bad practice. You don't want to tell the public how many users you have. So to do that, we'll go to our user model, and let's add a UUID field here. So up here at the top, I'll say UUID, and this will have a type of datatypes.UUID like that. And we can also give it a default value so that it generates automatically. And we'll say datatypes.UUID v4. And now this, each time we create a user, it's going to generate a UUID for it. So let's save. And now if we actually restart our app, so say node app and hit enter, it should actually edit our table. So if we do d users, it actually has a new field of UUID. So that's cool. That was added. Now, the problem with this approach, by the way, is if I select from my users, I'll see that that user was deleted. So each time we sync the database, it's dropping the table, and we're losing all of our data. So that's not a good practice. So what's better than using sync? Of course, in production, you're going to use something called migrations, which is going to create the tables that you need based on your models and based on whatever you put yourself. So actually, if you go to migrations, you'll see it already generated a create user migration when we generated the user model. So that's cool. We can use this to create the table instead of syncing. So I'm going to change here the table name from uppercase users, both up there and down here. And by the way, if you don't know how migrations work, they have an up function, which when you run the migration, it executes it. So in this case, it creates the table with all these fields. And if you want to undo the migration, it runs the down, which in this case drops the table. So it basically just reverses the changes that this migration operated on the table. So here I'm going to as well add to these fields that they're not nullable. So add to all of them, allow null of false. And also add the UUID field. So I'm just going to go and copy it from there and paste it here. One thing, by the way, in migrations, the database is called Sequelize, which is strange. I don't know why they have it different from the models to the migrations. Maybe it has a purpose, but I'm just going to change the Sequelize to data types because it's just representing data types here. So I'll change this to data types like that. So it's less confusing. And if you want to copy something from the model to the migration, it doesn't error on you. So if we go back, actually, if we go to the terminal, let's drop our database. So let's say Sequelize db drop and hit enter. Okay, it says the database is being accessed, yeah, because I'm connected to it in my pSQL. So I'm just going to connect to the default Postgres database. And now I'm going to run the same command. And now it's dropped the database. Let's create it again. So db create, hit enter. And now if we go back to our app.js, let's remove this Sequelize sync. And instead, let's say Sequelize authenticate, which is a method that does exactly that, authenticates to the database. And here, instead of saying synced, we'll say database connected. And now, of course, if we run our app, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to create the tables. Our database is still empty. So if we connect back to it, so Sequelize _db, and we do \d, we have no relations, no tables or anything. So to have the table, we just simply run the migration. So if we go back to our terminal and say Sequelize db:\migrate and hit enter, it's now migrated the create user migrations. And if we go back to our database and run the same command, we see that we have a table called users. And so it's created. And we also have a table called Sequelize meta. And if we actually select from it, so let's say select star from and wrap it with double quotations and hit enter, we see that it actually stores every migration that you run so that it keeps track and knows what migrations have ran and which ones that they haven't. Now, each time we run our app, it doesn't actually touch the database, which is a good practice. So now let's actually test that again. Let's actually, I forgot. Now I'm going to use nodemon so I don't have to keep restarting the server. I have it installed globally. So I'm going to say nodemon app.js and hit enter. Now it started our app. And here, if I run this again, we get a UID and we get the ID and we get that user. So that's cool. One thing, of course, if you're creating an API, you want to hide this ID from your user. You don't want the public to know this actual ID in the database. So the way we do that is easy. We go back to our user model and we know each time we fetch the user in our app, we can use the ID, but once we return it to the user, we need to hide it. So there is this function that is actually in the models. In every model class, there's a function called toJSON. So toJSON, and we can override it here. So this basically, each time you return a user in an API response as a JSON, this is executed and this decides which fields are returned. So here, if we override it and say return and do an object like this, and then spread this.get, which is a function that gets exactly just the fields of this object, and then we override the ID and we say that the ID is undefined and we save. Now if we go back here and let's create a different user, Jane Doe, and here change this to Jane and hit enter. There we go. Now we don't get the ID, even though it's actually created and exists on the database. It's hidden away from our users. Now let's create an endpoint where we fetch all of our users. So let's go back to our app.js. I'm actually going to close everything. And here in app.js, I'm going to create another endpoint. So I'll say app.get, and this will be /users, and this will have an async resolver, async request, response, and do an arrow function. Here, let's do a try catch block. And let's say const users equals await user.find. Now the find, usually you give it a condition of which fields you want to filter by, but if you don't give it any condition, it's just going to find all of the users. So here we can say return res.json and we pass it the users. Of course, let's do a catch block and error. If there's an error, we're just going to console log it, and then we're going to return a res.status 500, and then we're going to return a JSON of error, something went wrong. Wrong. Let's save that. And now because I have nodemon running, it's going to restart the app automatically. Let's go back to Insomnia. I'm actually going to save this as a request, and let's save this as create. I'll create a new one, new request, and this will be read. Create that. I'm just going to copy this endpoint. So localhost 5000/users, run that. Okay, we get something went wrong. Let's check our console. So user.find is not a function. Actually, my bad, it's find all. So let's go back. This is find all. So what happens when you switch text stacks all the time? Let's run. There we go. We get an array of 2 users. And of course, the ID is hidden as well, because each time we fetch it, it's hidden in any resolver. So that's cool. Let's create an endpoint, which I like to call the find, which is when you want to find only one object, one user. So let's just duplicate one of these. So the read, I'm going to duplicate it into a find. And let's go back here. I'm actually just going to copy this one more time. And here I'll say /:UUID, because we just need to find one by a UUID. And here, well, let's get that from the parameters. So we'll say const UUID equals request.params.UUID. And here in the user, we need to use find one and then pass it a condition. So here inside the condition, the condition is a where. And here we'll say where UUID is UUID, but because there's the same name, we can just say it like this. And this is user, and this is user, and let's just save. This should work. And now we go back to Insomnia. Let's go back to the read. Let's say we wanted to fetch John Doe. So let's copy his UUID and go to the find. Here, get users slash that UUID, paste it, run that, and there we go. We get only John. So that's the find endpoint working. Now let's say we want to create another database model called posts, and users can create posts in our database and then they can fetch them. So let's go back to our terminal. Let's close it. Let's say Sequelize model generate, and let's give it a name. So dash name post, and let's give it some attributes, and it's just gonna have a body, which is a string. I hit enter, and let's go to our models. So here we have a post model. Ooh, close that. I'm gonna change, so here let's give it a table name, and make that posts with all lowercase, put a comma there, and the body, let's make that not nullable, so make that into an object, say type, data types.string. By the way, there are like all the types, there's integer. I don't know if there's no IntelliSense here, but you can go back to the documentation and you can go to data types, and you can see how you can use all the SQL data types like this. For now, I'm only using string, but you can use anything that you need from this. And also, if you use Postgres, you're going to have access to enums and JSONs and all advanced types. So let's go back. So that's still a string. We need to tell it that allow null, it needs to be false. And actually, I want to give the post a UUID as well. So I'm just going to open the user model. I'm going to copy the UUID from here and then paste that here, save. Let's go to the migration that was created for creating posts. And here we need to add also to the body that allow null is false, and then also paste that UUID. And let me change that Sequelize to data types here. So data types, and then change this post to lowercase posts and save. And let's open the terminal and let's run this migration. And by the way, you can also run Sequelize db :migrate :status and hit enter, and it's going to tell you that we have this migration that we need to we have this migration that has already run up, and then we have create post is down. We haven't run it yet. So if we do db migrate and hit enter, it's going to run the create post migration, and it's going to create the posts table. One thing I actually forgot to add is that I want inside the post model, or inside the post table, to have an ID of a user, because every post belongs to a user. It can't be just linked to no user. And also the user can have a lot of posts. And if this is called an association or a relation in general in SQL, and this particular one is one-to-many. So the way we can set up this relation is we can go to associate, or association in this framework they call it. So here in the associate, this associate gets all the models. So we can straight away destructure from it the user model. And we can say this, which refers to the post class, dot belongs to, and then we can pass it the user model. Now, the way Sequelize works is by default, if you don't pass it which foreign key that it needs to look for, it's going to look for the name of the model plus the primary key, which is, so the name of the model is user, and then plus the primary key is ID. So it's going to look for this field. But I want to name it user with lowercase u like that, so camel cased. So to override the default behavior, we can simply add some options to this. And we can say foreign key, and then say user ID like that. And then let's set up the other side of the relation, or the association. So let's go to the user, and inside the associate, we can destructure the post, and here we'll say this dot has many, and then we pass, we pass the model post, and then we pass the options. So foreign key will be user ID like that. So let's save. Now, actually, I forgot we need to add that to the migration as well. So here in the migration, let's add another field, user ID, and this will be a type of data types dot integer. And of course, allow null here is false. And let's put a comma there. Let's save. Now we need to rerun that migration. So we need to revert to this migration and run it again. So the way we can do that, we can say Sequelize db migrate undo and hit enter. So this will actually revert the latest migration. And if you want to revert all of them, you can do undo all, but I'm not going to do that right now. So now it reverts it. Now if I migrate again, it's going to migrate that same migration, but in this time it's going to create the user ID. To check, if we go to Postgres and we do describe posts and hit enter, we get that our post has a user ID with indeed lowercase user ID because that's what we created, and this will refer to the other table. So that's cool. Now let's create an endpoint to create a post. So here we can say app.post, and this will be to /posts, and this will have an async handler, async request response. And then inside of here, I'm going to do a try catch block. And let's assume that we have authentication and we can know who this user is just by from the body. So we can destructure from the body the user UUID, and then we're going to get the body from request body. So request.body. Don't confuse yourself. This is a body variable inside the request body, not the request body itself. So here, actually, let's go back up and import the post model. And let's go back down. And here we need to fetch the user based on this user UUID. So it's a const user equals await user dot find one. And then we're going to pass it a condition of where, and where the UUID equals user UUID. And now we can create that post. So we'll say const post equals await post dot create, and then we'll pass it the body, and we'll pass it a user ID of user.id. Now let's return that post. So return res.json post. Here let's do a catch. If there's an error, we're just going to console log it, and then let's actually return it. So return res.status 500.json error. Let's save. Let's make sure our server is running. Actually, I'm going to run it again, nodemon app. If you go back to Insomnia, I'm going to create a new request. I'm just going to copy that endpoint. New request, create post, and it's a post, create that. And here I'm going to paste that and change that to /posts. And here I'm going to add a JSON body. And here we'll have a body, which is the body of the post. And I can say this is a new post. And now we're going to have a user UUID. And then let's actually take, for example, Jane's UUID. Let's go back to the create post and paste that here. And let's run that. And indeed, we get a response back with that post, with the user ID of that post, which is 2, which is indeed Jane's ID. And then we get also the UID of the post, the body, and the ID of the post. Now, of course, we want to hide these 2 fields. So we can simply go back to our post model. And here override the to JSON. And then we'll say return an object. And we spread the this.get. And then we say ID is undefined, and also user ID is undefined. Save that. Now let's create a second one, a second post, and then run that. And indeed, we don't get the ID and the user ID as well. So those 2 are hidden away. Now let's say we wanted to get the post, and we also wanted to get the user of the post without the user ID. So to do this, we need to use the relations to fetch those relations. Excuse me, I keep saying relations, but they're associations in Sequelize, but they're kind of the same. So let's create another get endpoint to get all the posts. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it, change the post to get, and then remove. We're not going to have a request body, remove that. And then here, we're going to say const posts equal await post dot find all. And then we return those posts, save. Now, if we duplicate this, and let's say it's read posts, create that, change this to a get, remove the body, and then run that. We get the posts. So if we want to get the user of the posts, inside the find all, we're going to pass some options, and we can say include, and then we pass it an array of models, and we could just say the user model like that, and that should work. And indeed it does work. So every post now has its user attached to it. So that's cool. I want to change this user to lowercase because it doesn't make sense. It's a variable, it should be lowercase. So the way we can do that, we can simply say here inside the include, make this into an object and say model is user, and then we can say as, and then pass it user like that, just with lowercase. And now it fetches it. Actually, no. Sequelize eager loading error. Okay, let me check why that happened. Does not match the aliases defined. Okay, I know why. You have to define your association with that alias. So here, in the associate belongs to user, here we can we need to say as user here, so that we can use it as user in the resolver or in the handler. So if we run this now, it actually works and it's lowercase user. Another advantage of defining your association here and giving it an alias here is that each time you want to fetch the user, you don't need to write all of this. You can simply say include and then give it as a string like that, user. And now using that alias, it knows which relation to fetch. So that's cool. I think you can pass a singular one as well. Let me try that. Yeah, okay, that's cool. If you need multiple relations or associations, you pass an array and then you pass user and the other ones. But if you need one, you could just pass it as a string like that. Now let's do the same for user. Let's say when we fetch a user, we want to fetch their post as well. So let's go back to the user and let's give this an alias. So as, and this is posts because there's multiple ones. Save that, go back to app.js. Now where we find the user here, we can say include, and then actually without the array, posts like that, save, and then go back to Insomnia, go to find the user, run that. Actually, John doesn't have any posts, so if we get Jane's UUID, and we go back to the find, paste that there, and run that, we get Jane's object, and also with the posts that she posted. So that's cool. And now we are fetching both sides of the association, both from the post side and also from the user side. So that's nice. One thing that I wanted to demonstrate as well is right now we have no validation. So if we run the create with just empty fields, actually not empty fields, because we have the, well, actually it does create them with empty fields. That's strange. Oh, because they're not null. It does create them. So obviously this is behavior that we don't want to happen. We want to have some sort of validation to prevent this from happening. So we go back to our code base. We can, of course, write JavaScript validation before we run the, the create method here, but obviously we want to leverage as much of Sequelize as we can. So if we go back to our user model, here inside of our fields, we can actually add for each field a key called validate. And here inside the validate, we can have multiple validation rules. So if you click control space, you see that there's so many different validation rules. And if you want to understand more about them, you can go back to the documentation and go to, where is it actually, model querying. Actually, no, validations and constraints. So here, if you scroll down, you'll see it shows you how to use that validate key. Actually, no, this is showing you how to use the unique. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there's so many different validation rules that you can use. And these actually apply before the SQL query is run. So that's Sequelize doing its magic. And you can also create your own custom validation rules, which is pretty nice. So for this, well, I'm going to just use some simple validation rules. And here I say I want to use the not null validation rule, which prevents sending null values. And you can also, instead of just setting it to true, which does the job, you can also give it an object with an MSG for message field to specify the exact error message that you want to occur once this happens. So let's say the message here will say user must have a name, And also we need to do the same for not empty, because this can be an empty string. So we'll say not empty, and here we'll say name must not be empty. And let's say, actually, let's copy that for all the other ones. So copy that here and replace this with email, and then copy that here, replace that with role. Now let's save that, and if we go back to Insomnia and we run this, we indeed get errors. And if you go here, you see we have an array of errors. Here the error has a path name, and the message name must not be empty. And if we remove name completely and we run that, it says user must have a name. So this is saying it's triggering the not null validation rule. So that's cool. If we scroll down, we see as well the other ones, email, and also, is it just these two? Yeah, role is valid. So if I run that, now we'll get the ones for role as well. So that's nice. Now we have validation, which makes sure that we can't give like some wrong like data. So let's say here we want to create a user called user. Actually, for email, we can also add the other validation rule for checking for emails. So is email, and here I'll give it a message, and it says must be a valid email address. Save that, and let's go back. Now, even if the email is not empty now, if I just say user, it's gonna complain. So here it says email must be a valid email address, and so now if I say at email, it's still gonna be invalid. So if I say at email.com, which is a valid email address, and I run that, now indeed it actually creates that, and it passes the validation rules. We don't have to actually write our custom validation. We can just leverage the validation that Sequelize gives us. We've pretty much covered like most of the things that you will use. I actually want to just show you how to do the other API endpoints like delete and update. So let's say we want to perform those on users. So let's go down here. I'm going to copy this. And let's say this is the delete. So I'll change this to app.delete. And this is going to be the same. It's going to be the same. And once we find the user, find user, I should have kept that UUID. So where UUID, and we don't need to include the posts because we're just going to delete this user. And here we'll say await user.destroy. Destroy like that. And then of course the user doesn't exist. So it's just going to return a message user deleted. Like that. And let's also do the update. So here I'll paste that again, and this will be app.put, and this will be to the UID. What can we change? We can change, let's say, the name. Actually, we can change everything. So let's say const name, email, and role equal request.body. And here we're gonna fetch that user. So fetch the user like that. And here we'll say user dot name equals name, and then we're gonna do that twice, and then we'll say email, and we'll say role, and here we'll say await user dot save, which will update the user, and here we'll we'll return the user like that. So both of these should work. So let's go back to our Insomnia. I'm just going to duplicate this, and I'll call this delete like that. And I'll change this to a delete method. And here, let's actually grab the user at email user UUID. Actually, let's edit this user before we delete him. So let's say I wanted to change his name to user name. Let's actually double check in Postgres. So let's go to PSQL and say select star from users, run that. So you see we have this user here with the user at username with the name user. So now if we say his name is user name, I'm saying the same user a bunch of times, and his email is user at again user, why not, and the role is actually user, not an admin, and run that. Oh, actually I deleted, my bad, I wanted to actually update it. So now I ran delete. So if I run that select, indeed that user is gone. So he was ID 4, now he's gone. Let's say we want to update this one that doesn't have any name and email, but the role admin. So let's grab this UID, and actually, so I'm gonna remove this body. So I'm gonna duplicate this, and I'll call this update, create, and now this will be a put, and we're gonna have a JSON body, and let's give it a name of user or new user, and an email of new@email.com, and then a role of just maybe super admin. Run that. Okay, get something went wrong. Let's check our terminal. Can't read property name of null. Huh. Is it null? Let's try to just return this. Turn res.json user, save that. Run this. Oh, it's actually null. Oh, maybe I was given the wrong. Oh, my bad. I forgot to paste the new UID. All right, so let's run that. Okay, so we get the same user, and it's not updating it. Oh, because I'm just returning it. My bad. Let me save that. Now let's run that. Cool. It's actually updated now to super admin, and the name is new user, and the email is new@email.com. And if we double check in the database, we select. Oops. Oh no, I was there. So select. All right. So we get new user, new@email, and super admin. So indeed, it's actually updated in the database. All right. So I think we checked off everything. Let me check. Actually, seeders. All right, let me show you how to use seeders. This is a nice feature that not a lot of ORMs pack. So what seeders are basically, it's just a file that allows you to create some dummy data or any type of data that you want in your database. So let's say Sequelize. Let's say, for example, we wanted to use to create 2 dummy users each time we're developing to use them as an example. So you can say use Sequelize seed : generate, and then -- name create fake users, like that. Hit enter, and now we get this seeder, and it has like a migration, an up and a down as well. So we can copy actually these commented lines. So all of this, paste that here, remove the stars. So here we have this query interface object, which allows us to insert data to the database. So let's say we wanted to insert into the users table, and we have a name of John Doe, and we want to give it an email as well. One thing, by the way, about the query interface, it's not like the model instance. It doesn't generate the other fields. So we actually need to give it values. So I'm actually going to copy this UID, and here say, let's give an email. So john@email.com, and then UID of that UID. And also, actually, we need to give the timestamp. So let's copy this created at, and let's say created at, and give it that created at, duplicate that, and make this into updated at. Updated at. Actually, I forgot about the role. The role is admin. All right. And also in the down, let's copy this and paste it here. And this basically just deletes all of the users. So change that into users. Let's add another one. So here do comma, paste. And this other one will be Jane Doe. Jane. Change the email to Jane. And then maybe change a couple of these numbers. And everything should be fine. Save. I'm going to open now in PSQL and just delete all the users. So delete from users with colon, hit enter. And now we indeed have no users. So now if I go back to the other terminal and say Sequelize db seed all, it's going to run all the seeders. So it's run the seeders. So now if we go back to the database and we select, we indeed have those 2 users. So they're created. So now each time if you want to reset your database, you can just reset it and run the seeder to have that data to work with, and you don't have to manually create them again. So that's a nice feature. All right, so that was basically 90% or 95% of the things that you'll use when you use Sequelize. That should cover all the fundamentals, and I hope you learned something in this video. Please let me know in the comments if you like Sequelize and if you're going to use it. I really like it. I'm going to use it in a massive course that I'm working on, and you're going to really, really love it. Again, please do smash the like button. if you haven't, and subscribe, of course, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.